Hello, this is Jonathan Lampel with Blender HD, and I'm pretty excited for this tutorial, and it is an introduction to fire simulation in Blender. So, there's a lot of different ways to do it. If you look back at the old, well, not old, but like older tutorials from like Andrew Price and other things like that that show you how to make a flamethrower, they do it a lot differently than we're going to do it today, but I'll show you a couple different ways to make fire because there have been some recent improvements in the smoke sim. Actually, I mean they're not that recent. They're about a little less than a little bit more than 6 months old by now. So you should be you might be familiar with them, but I will show you kind of the basics of the different settings and how to get different types of fire. So we're not going to be going for a specific effect in this video. It'll just be an overview of the different settings and what to adjust to get what kind of effect, and just a few tips and tricks to get good looking fire inside of Blender. So here, the only thing I have set up is I just opened up a new scene, and as I play this back, it's basically just a sphere and it moves around, and that's just so we can see what the fire looks like in motion. So to start off, all I'm going to do is go to the physics panel and hit smoke and flow. And if we play that back, it does nothing. That's because we need a domain. And what a domain is basically a container that the fluid, or the smoke in this case, is inside. So domains have to be cubes, so I'm going to go ahead and add a cube. And it works best if you scale it up proportionally. So if you just scale it up like this and pick a random size, it'll probably work. But it works a whole lot better if I say hit S and then 5 and scale it up 5 times. And you'll see now that if I hit smoke and domain, you get some smoke options there. And if I play this back, that emits smoke, and then when it's outside, it only emits smoke while it's inside the domain. So that works as expected. I'm going to scale it up a little bit bigger. This is pretty big, but that's alright. And then just to make sure that it is entirely in the domain the entire time. Alright, that should be great. Maybe I can move it up a little bit. And just so we can see what's going on, I'm going to increase the divisions to 64 and turn on adaptive domain. And we'll be going over these settings a little bit later, but that's just so we can more clearly see what's going on, and the adaptive domain makes it render in the viewport a little bit faster. So first I'm going to show you how to emit the smoke, or fire in this case. You can see that now we have a new flow type that we didn't have in the previous versions of Blender. And what we can do is we can change this from smoke, outflow, fire and smoke, or fire. And you already know what smoke does. It just, emits smoke. Outflow is basically the opposite of an inflow, and it acts as kind of like a vent or something that basically when it collides, it erases it. So maybe if you have like a vent or something, I don't know, but that can be really handy. And then the other two options are fire and smoke and fire. And these are two completely different things. So you can see if I hit just fire, then it's going to, emit fire. But it also has a little bit of smoke. And so what you can do is, if you want to have a fire that then emits the smoke, then you can just choose fire. But if you choose fire and smoke, the emitter is going to emit both fire and smoke at the same time. So it's kind of a subtle difference, but it really does make sense, because in this case the emitter, or the object, is the one that's emitting the smoke, but in the other case of when I just choose fire, it's the fire itself that's emitting the smoke. So you don't get these outside edges of smoke. The smoke is being emitted by the fire itself and not the object. So that's an important distinction to make when you're working with this. So I'm going to go ahead and choose fire for this. And moving on, you see that we now have a flow source. So before it was only particle system, but now we can use mesh. So if you notice that as we went ahead, we didn't have to make a particle system or anything. All we had to do was just hit play. It was automatically set to mesh, and it just emits the smoke from each individual face or surface. And you can go ahead and change this by creating a particle system, and I'll just make an example one real quick, where that'll be my particle system, just the default settings, and I can choose particle system, and now the smoke is going to be emitted by the particles instead. So mostly I'm going to be going over the mesh options because I like using that a whole lot better, and there's ups and downs to both, because when you're working with mesh emitting smoke, one thing that you can't quite do is have it follow the particles unless you use an explode modifier. So if I wanted it to follow the particles, but I still wanted to have these settings of how much fire or smoke is emitted from the surface, or how far away it's emitted from the surface, I can go ahead and add an explode modifier and maybe up the subdivisions a little bit. And if I play this back, I need to have the smoke down there after the explode modifier. Now you can see it's doing the exact same thing as the particles, except now I have a little bit more control over what's going on. So you know, either way, you can do what you like. I'm not going to do that right now, but it's just an example, because sometimes when you're using particles, you can't control how much or how far away it is being emitted from the particles. So say if you have a particle system like here, and you have super high divisions, you're going to get these tiny pinpoints of fire, and you can't really control how large those little pinpoints are. Whereas if you use surface or mesh, then you have complete control over that. So, I mean, the downside is you do have to increase the subdivisions, but you know, you can decide which one works better for you in your workflow. So at this point, I'm not really going to go over particle systems. I think that's a topic for another tutorial, so I'm just going to move on with fire. As I said before, As I said before, this surface option here just says how far away it's being emitted from the surface. So if I set this really high to 5, it's going to be emitted 5 units more away from the surface. And if I set this to as low as it can be, which is 0.5, then it's going to be emitted very, very close. And then volume, what that does is it basically emits smoke from the volume as well. And this is really easy to see when you have two disconnected meshes, which I don't have in this case, but it uses the calculated volume to emit smoke as well as the surface. Alright, so now that we have that down, we can kind of just take a look and see what this looks like right now before we change any settings, so you can get a feel of what is actually changing when I change the settings. I'm going to go ahead and show you the absolute density and flame rate. So flame rate is pretty self-explanatory. If I set this to something low like 0, it's obviously not going to do anything. It's not going to flame at all. And if I set this to something higher like 2, it's going to emit more and more flame. So basically the flame rate is just the amount of flame being emitted. Alright, and then absolute density is just one little checkbox, but it makes all the difference. So you can see as I play this back, you get this one single trail that just kind of evaporates after a while, and it looks like a normal fireball. However, if I uncheck this, you'll see that it looks completely different. You get this massive jet of fire, and what's happening is that it's calculating, or there's no absolute density, so it can be a very, very high dense volume, and in the settings here you have density and temperature difference, and so it's taking that density and making it, I don't know how to explain it quite right, but basically what you need to know is that, if you have it unchecked, it creates kind of those jets of flame, and you can control this even more using the flame rate. So if I set this to 0.1 and play this back, I will get, well, maybe that's a bit small. You'll get a similar effect to the ball that we had earlier, except now that sometimes you can have flames that come off of the tail. So like that, you see we had a flame up there like that, and it's creating flames outside of the one main fireball. I hope that makes sense. is a little bit weird, but you can see when I play this back, there's nothing really coming off of it except in small cases up here. But when I checked or unchecked that and reduced that, you can see that there's actually pieces coming off. And if I left it at 1, you get a flame kind of jet, like a flame geyser, and that can be really cool. And just play around with it, and whatever effect you're kind of going for, that might just be the key. So moving on to some settings down here, initial velocity is pretty important. So if I check that, you can see that now as it moves around, the movement of the object actually affects the flame. So you can see how it's kind of rotating and flowing with the air like it would normally. So that is very, very cool, and you can set that to anywhere from 0 to I don't know how high it goes. Yeah, 2 is the highest. And basically that's just saying how much the movement of the object is affecting the flow of the fire. And then normal is basically the same thing as that, but it's how much the normal direction is affecting the smoke or the fire. So if I set that really high, you can see that it's now kind of emitting it along the normals, and it's emitting it more and more, which means more fire is being created. So if I lower that to say 1, it'll kind of shoot it out of the normals a little bit, which means that since it's adding more velocity, then more fire is going to be emitted as well. So just keep that in mind, that all these settings kind of affect how much fire is being emitted, but there's a lot more to it than that, and you can really fine-tune these things to get the effect that you like. So I will turn that off for now and move on to Smoke Flow Advanced. And there's a couple really cool new features that we can now use. So the first one I'll go over is Vertex Group, which I'm sure you might be familiar with vertex groups in Blender by now. What I can do is go to the data panel, select these, add a vertex group, and assign. So you can see that only these vertices are in that group, and so if I choose that vertex group, the fire is only going to be emitted from those vertices. And you might not think this is a huge deal, but it really is when you take into account that dynamic paint and other modifiers can affect vertex groups. So you can actually have an object catching another one on fire using dynamic paint, and that is very, very cool. So I'm just going to delete that. And another option that we have is texturing. So we can now use a texture to define where the smoke is. So if I go into Blender Render, which we should be in anyway, because that's the only way to render smoke at the moment, and if I make a new texture, I'll call this Fire Density, and just choose that one there. You can see that it is affecting the flame. And I can go in here and change the different attributes of this. So if I turn up the brightness really, really high, it's going to emit more and more flame. And if I set this low, it's going to emit less. But it's a little bit more than that, because now that you have noise that can emit fire, you can have it so that it's not uniformly emitting smoke. So for example, if I just have a plane, let me just demo this for you real quick, and if I want, no, not fluid, if I want that to emit fire, and I play this back, you can see that it's all going to be emitted in one kind of solid plane. However, if I choose to use a texture, fire density, and maybe up the contrast, up the size. I don't know if you can see it real well, but there we go. You can see that it's being emitted in that exact shape. So this can be really, really handy. You can animate all of these values, and you can choose, how high it is, how large it is, excuse me. And there's lots of different things that you can do to really get a more realistic effect. So it's not being all emitted uniformly. The fire is actually kind of dancing along the surface. And one thing you can do you can set this to, UV or generated mapping, and, select how large you want it. So if I change that, you can see as we play this back, it just changed the size of the texture. The last really cool thing about this is you can animate the offset. So if I keyframe something there, and then on my last keyframe, I can set this to something ridiculous like 10. And now if I play this back, you can see that that texture is being animated and emitting smoke or emitting fire from the texture as it's animated, and that really gives it a nice realistic effect if you have a flat surface like this where it looks kind of unnatural for it all to be emitted at once. And you can see that now, instead of having that kind of flat edge, you get this nice nice kind of natural effect, and it looks good. So 10 was a pretty extreme example, but that's pretty cool. And remember, when you're doing stuff like this, then definitely go into the animation editor and press V and make those vector curves so that they're uniform. Otherwise, it's just going to start out slow, speed up, and slow down. And with natural simulations like fire, that just looks a little bit silly. Okay, so I think that now we've gone over all of the settings here. So let's jump over to the domain settings. Sorry, got a little bit of a cold, so my voice is a little bit scratchy and stuffy, but alright, so as you saw before, that the divisions up here increased the quality of the simulation. And while that's true, it's also a common misunderstanding, because just because you increase the divisions doesn't mean your simulation is going to look better. All it means is that it's going to have more voxels per square inch or square foot or whatever. So one other thing that it does is it also increases and decreases the size of the domain. So you see, when I change this from 64 to 32, it should, let's see, I guess not this time, maybe it did earlier. Last time it was kind of shrinking and resizing the domain just ever so slightly when you change this, and maybe it's when I don't have that checked. I don't know. But basically, just remember that it changes the amount of voxels per square inch, so it's going to give you a higher resolution, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to look better. So just keep that in mind to make sure you keep those two definitions separate. So you can see if I set this even higher, then it's going to definitely take longer, and it's going to decrease the size of those steps, and it's just going to look better. So I'm going to turn that back down to 64 for now, so we can actually see things as they're going. Alright, so down here in the time scale, what's going on is it's basically the speed of simulation, but not necessarily the speed of the flames, but the speed of the kind of like a slow motion effect or like a sped up motion. So if I set this to 0.5, you can see it's just going to slow down the entire simulation. So it doesn't slow down the animation, but it slows down the simulation of the fire. And if I set this to a higher value, then it's going to speed up the simulation. Finally, the border collision is pretty important because you can either choose open, collide all, or vertically open. And what this does is it just tells Blender how to interact with the domain. So say if you have a really small domain, do you want the smoke and fire to be bouncing off the walls, which would be collide all? Do you want them to be bouncing off the walls except the ceiling, which is vertically open? And open just means that the smoke passes right through it as if those aren't walls at all. Okay, so moving on to the behavior over here. Basically, these just affect how the smoke and fire reacts. It's a lot easier to see when you're using smoke, so I will go ahead and switch to that momentarily. So the density, what it does is it just tells Blender how much the smoke rises based on the density size. So if I set this to something like negative 0.01, it's going to fall where there's more density. So you can see in the places where the smoke is thicker, it's going to not rise as much. And the lower I set this, the more it's going to shrink. So if I set this to something fairly low, like negative 0.1, in places where it's really dense, it's going to fall back down to the ground. So kind of like, if you set this to -1, it might be like a sort of dry ice effect, which is kind of cool. But remember, that's based on the density of the smoke. So I think the default value is negative 0.001, so I'll leave it at that. Temperature difference is the same thing, except it's based on the temperature. Oh, sorry. So, if I set this something really high, then it's going to, make the smoke move faster when the higher the temperature difference between the domain and the actual smoke or fire, it's going to increase, how much it rises. And, if I lower that again, it's going to pretty much stay the same. The only thing affecting it now is the density. So you can definitely play around with those to get some cool effects. They are really, really important. And remember that when I change this to a fire simulation, it's going to drastically affect the temperature difference, most importantly. So you can see that the smoke is acting differently, and that's because it's being emitted around the fire, which is very, very hot compared to the surrounding area. So it's always going to be moving up fairly fast. And then as the smoke cools off, then it slows its ascent. Okay, so moving on, we have this option here for Vorticity. And what that does is it just is the amount of rotation in the fluid. That's what the little tooltip says. And you might think, oh good, if I want, kind of curly smoke, you want to add a lot of vorticity. But let's just see what happens if I do that. I believe the high setting is 4. So if I go ahead and do that, you can see that, it looks okay. It looks like a lot more noisy. But if I set this to a higher resolution and play this back, I don't think you can see it all that well right now. So let me just change this to smoke again. All of these things do apply to fire. It's just easier to see with smoke. You see you get a lot of these just little tiny noise clouds. And what it's doing, if you set it too high, you're just going to get a bunch of noise. You're not going to get a nice curly effect. You're just basically adding noise at this point. And if I set that to 0, you can see there's going to be no noise. It's more like a candle flame or a, something of that nature. So usually 2 is a fairly safe bet, but you can change that to lower or higher. And remember, that's going to really drastically change how your smoke looks. And don't think of it more as the amount of rotation, but think of it more as the size of the rotation, and that'll help you a lot. So if you set this really, really low, you're going to get lots of tiny, tiny rotations, which means you're just going to have this cloud of noise, which doesn't look very good. And if you set it too low, you're going to get these large kind of rotations, which means it's going to be all silky smooth. So generally you want something somewhere in between. So like, maybe 1 or 3 or, 2. That works great. Dissolve, basically it just dissolves the smoke or the fire over time. You can see pretty much the effect right there, and the time indicates how fast it's dissolving. And if I uncheck slow, then it instead of gradually fading out, it just erases it immediately. Okay, so now I'll go back to fire, because that's what this tutorial is about, so we should probably talk about fire. Okay, sorry I'm all stuffy and coughing. This is awful, but hopefully you can bear it. Let's see, smoke flames. So the speed here is indicating how fast the flames kind of I don't want to say evaporate because that's definitely not the right word, but how fast the flames kind of uh, dissolve, burn out. I don't know. Um, but you can see if I just set this to something low, then it's not going to dissolve as fast, resulting in a much taller flame. So it's not how fast the flames are going, it's how fast it dissolves. So keep that in mind for sure, because that's a pretty important difference. And you can see if I set that high, then it's going to dissolve very, very fast. So I think that was at like 0.75. The smoke is just the amount of smoke emitted. If I set that to 0, it's not going to emit any smoke at all. And if I set that to something, more like 2, it's going to emit more smoke. And yeah, so that just tells it how much smoke to emit. And remember, we have dissolve on, so if I uncheck that, then you can see it more clearly. I'm going to leave that to 0 at the moment, because now when I play this back, the adaptive domain is just going to be smaller, which means that it's going to be faster in my viewport. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to leave that at 0. Now, vorticity is the same thing as it was here, except it's in addition to the smoke. So this affects the smoke and the fire, but this only affects the fire. So the max you can have vorticity is 4. However, you can add another 2 on top of that, so you could make the vorticity of the fire 6. And just remember the same thing that I said earlier, is it's not necessarily the amount of rotation, it's the size of the rotation. Okay, so that's looking good. The temperatures is something that's really, really cool. Having fuel inside of here is very, very nice. And basically, this is more like the speed of the flame and how, basically just how hot it is. So if I set this really, really low and that really low, you can see those are the minimum values, then it's just going to act kind of like a cooler fire. So, I mean, fire in its nature isn't exactly cool, but if you had a cool fire, that's what it would look like. And if I set this as high as possible, then you can see it's going to act like a very, very hot fire, making it, speed up a lot. These flames are going super, super fast, and that's what it looks like. Something to be really careful, though, is the faster that the fire moves, the more chance you're going to get these horizontal lines. And you might be able to see if I turn on high resolution, is when I have it going really, really fast, sometimes you get these horizontal lines, and I'm not seeing them right now. Basically what they are is these lines that kind of look like this, coming out of the emitter, and it doesn't look very good. And the way to reduce that is just to not have it emit as fast. And that might be kind of bothersome, because sometimes you really do need fast fire. But that's the only thing I can tell you to fix that. Honestly, I've been having trouble with that lately, but generally it turns out well. It's just once in a while you'll get that, and it's not a very optimal result, but right now it looks good. So moving on, the adaptive domain, I already checked this. You can see what it does. It just kind of only bakes the area where you actually need the fire, so all of this wasted space is not used. It's only using the necessary parts, which definitely speeds it up dramatically. So you see if I uncheck this, it's going to take a lot longer. But when I check that, bam, way faster. And sometimes when you're using a high amount of divisions and, high resolution, you get it where it's kind of, where the adaptive domain is cutting off the fire. And you don't want that at all, so you can add an additional amount of voxels, and that'll help that. And then the margin is basically the same kind of idea, except it's the margin around the fluid, so it applies only to the adaptive domain there. And the threshold is basically saying how much fluid there's allowed to be before it cuts off. So if I set this to way too high, it has a chance of cutting that off. You can see that's what it's doing right there. But if I set this as low as possible, then we are no longer in danger of it cutting off the fire and looking awful. It now looks good and works perfectly. Alright, so I actually have to go at the moment, so I will pause the recording and be back in a little bit to just finish this up, and I'll see you then. Alright, sorry for that long pause there. So, moving on, let's see, where did I leave off? I think it was high resolution. Okay, so remember that I said that the high number of divisions doesn't necessarily make it look good, it just increases the voxel size. So you can really see this when you play with high resolution. If I turn that off, you can see that it's just the pure voxels, but when I turn high resolution on, it's going to smooth those out and add a little bit of noise to it. So since I set the strength to 0, what it's doing is it's just smoothing it out completely. And then if I set that really high, it's going to add a lot of noise in there. And you can see it even more if I, go ahead and add more divisions. You can see that there's a lot more noise in there. And the lower I set it, the more smooth it's going to look. So as a general rule, if you want those nice crisp, kind of like fireplace flames, I would definitely go for something like 0. But if you're going for a little bit larger size flames, then I would definitely increase this. And so that's one thing that I do. So kind of the smaller you want the flame, the smaller you set this, the larger you want it, the larger you set that. And I mean, that's just kind of a rule of thumb. You definitely have to play with all the other stuff, but that's something to keep in mind. Smooth emitter is something you always want to have on, or else it'll get all blocky around the bottom there, even more than it already is. And I think that is it for the simulation. There is a smoke groups, which is basically just any group that's being affected. So you can have multiple flows that interact with different collisions, so that it doesn't necessarily, it might pass through one collision, but another smoke will hit it. I don't think I'll go through that right now, but that should be fairly self-explanatory. And lastly is the cache, and you have to save it in order to do so. But basically you just set how many frames you want it to start and stop, and then you click free all bakes and bake all dynamics, and it'll bake your smoke sim, and you'll be ready for rendering. The very, very last thing is field weights. This just is the gravity and amount of effect that force fields have on it. So if I added wind, I could adjust how much that affects it here, and I could also add those to a group and have only that group affecting the fire inside this domain. Alright, so I think I pretty much covered everything in terms of simulation. While I was taking that little break there, I decided to split this up into 2 parts so it's not too long for you. And this part is obviously over the simulation aspect, and the other part's going to be over the rendering, which I'll show you some cool tricks there. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.